Okay, shall I hand over to you then, Helen? Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to move this at the top to put speaker, show small active speaker. No, that's you, not me, but you can you see me?
Yeah, I
Yes.
can see everybody.
I can see Richard now.
Yeah, we're getting thumbs ups. Yeah.
John's turned himself off.
Show thumb scale video. That's me in the corner. Okay. Well, look, perhaps people can get rid of whatever they want to and keep me in the corner if that's where you want me, or get rid of me altogether, which might be a good idea. Because I haven't had my hair cut for I don't know how long, but we're all getting a bit looking like somebody we know. But however, are we okay then, Anne?
Right, yes, I'm going to mute everybody now, just in case.
Don't mute me, that's all.
Helen.
Don't mute me, that's all.
Right.
I'm not. Okay. Place House Ware. I hope you're all looking at a sort of skeleton of Place House Ware on the screen at the moment. Now, I'm feeling a bit of a fraud because this talk was advertised as being timber frame buildings in Hertfordshire and Essex and Place House Ware. This being because I've got two separate PowerPoints, one about timber frame buildings and one about Place House, and both of them include both items, but at different proportions. So I've opted this evening to give you the one which has more of Place House and less of other buildings, because I thought that was appropriate to the circumstances. But if you want to hear more about other buildings in Hertfordshire, then come another time or ask me back or whatever. But so I'm afraid you're lumbered at the moment with the one which I prepared for the AGM, I think. Oh no, it was when Dorothy had the recital with the singing lady and the lady with the polystyrene hair or whatever it was. Anyway, but so that was why. So some of you may have seen part of this before. However, what we're looking at the moment is a skeleton of Place House, which if you can get into your heads, the door on the top right, which you actually enter when you go into the building, which always gives me a real buzz as I go in, and the pillars, the four pillars holding up the actual main structure, and the crown post and on the top, which is actually holding up the actual roof at the top. So, and the actual finesse of the actual structure. So I'm going to bash on now with about the rest of it, and we'll get round back to where we started eventually. So Place House Ware exists in the middle of Ware, in West Street, and you go down a little entry between the chip shop and the chemist, and over your head is the Blue Coat Boy, because the Blue Coat School occupied Place House for a number of years in the 18th century, because the boys were moved out of London because of plagues and various things, and the younger children were kept in Ware and in various different places. But so it was used as a Blue Coat, and that's why it says Blue Coat Yard and Place House. So you go through the arch and you get into the yard at the back where Place House is. So that I put this in because there are people who don't know where and wouldn't know where to look to find it. Anyway, go through the arch and you will come across Place House. So this is the plaque which Dorothy had made for the visit, the commemoration of the visit by the Queen Mother in July 78, and the celebration that we had to celebrate the anniversary of that visit was there. So this is actually a picture of a picture of a picture of a picture, which Anne lent me out of the album at the back. But you can see the Queen Mum in the middle with a yellow hat on, and you can see Place House on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, you can see the row of cottages where the nurses looked after the boys. They had a bunch of boys each of the cottages, and they looked after them, they boarded with them, and they attended actual lessons in the actual school building, which was the Place House on the right of the picture. So that's the Queen Mum with a yellow hat. You can easily see her there. Anyway, these are the pillars of Place House. So that's the pillar that holds up the building, and that's Dorothy with her back to us. I didn't like to take a picture of her forehead because I thought it was a bit invidious. I'm not really into selfies, but thanks to Dorothy, this whole thing has taken wings, and we're infinitely grateful to her. And by the side, you can see the other pillar, which is actually holding the building up, and you can actually see the shape of it, and it is hexagonal and with its frilly bit at the bottom, and it got another frilly bit at the top, which is equally interesting. So my interest in these timber frame buildings stems from being married to this chap who was Adrian Gibson, and he died in 2006, very suddenly in the middle of doing work for historic royal palaces, because although he was a woodwork teacher in his first incarnation, then he became a sort of lecturer for the WEA and for the extramural departments and what have you, then worked for Hertfordshire Council and Essex, and then latterly for historic royal palaces, looking at the Tower of London and the Banqueting House, Kensington Palace, I can't remember the other one, Hampton Court. Anyway, but that was the sort of latter part of his career. And it was after looking in being filmed, at natural fact, in the Tower of London in March 2006, that the following day he actually died of an aneurysm, which was very sudden and whatever. However, that's what you would normally have met of him. I'm not going to talk unduly about timber frame building because it demands an enormous vocabulary, because each of these pieces of wood in these buildings has a name, and if you're going to talk about them, then you actually have to learn the vocabulary that is appropriate to the subject. And as you can see, it is quite confusing because there are names for each of the pieces of wood. But in order to actually have any conversation about it, you need to get your vocabulary sorted out. So I'm not going to entertain. You will see that in the back of most Pevsners, and that is in the back of a book about Coggeshall, which was recently published by the Society at Coggeshall in the back of their book. Anyway, so don't bother about all those words. We're not going to use them tonight. The only one that we are going to use is the one slap in the middle where it says crown post. So the crown post is the bit in the middle which holds the roof up, sitting on a beam which goes side to side and perches in the middle and holds up the collar purlin, which goes a long ways in the building. So that's the thing that we're interested in, plus other things, but that's the main one. Let's go on. Anyway, the study of these timber frame buildings arises from my husband's interest in the barns at Cressing Temple. These are barns which are south of Braintree and were built by the Templars because they're called Cressing Temple. Now, when we started into this interest in the 60s, when my children were in pushchairs and similar, the general opinion was that buildings in England, domestic buildings anyway, probably dated from the time of Henry VIII or a bit before, perhaps into Henry VII or so, but that most buildings did not survive from before 1400. However, the question with these barns was, if they were built by the Templars only existed between about 1150 and 1300. Therefore, if they were built by the Templars, they must date from the 1200s. And the question then was, how would we recognize work which did date from the 1200s? And how was it different from any later work which you might discover in any buildings around Hertfordshire and Essex, which is where we've been particularly interested in. So there are two barns here. This is the barley barn, and this is the wheat barn, named just because there are two crops which are commonly cultivated in that part. Anyway, the joke was, if they were built in the 1200s, how would we know? And how are they different from buildings which were built in the time of Henry VIII or Queen Elizabeth, or right up to Queen Anne, I suppose? They were still building timber-framed buildings. Because in Hertfordshire, our part of Hertfordshire anyway, the stone is virtually unobtainable, apart from bits of Tottenham. And if you want to build a building up till about the middle of the 18th century, when it became possible to transport heavy building materials from Welsh slate and heavy bricks, that you would use the local supplies of timber. So the timber buildings then, the barns here are entirely built of timber. There's no stone walls and stone gable ends like you'll see in the West Country. And if you go into the barley barn, you will see that there are very strange joints. I'm going to try and move this arrow around. Yes. So the joints that we're interested in are this one here, which actually is a twin to this one, you can see, and there's a twin to the on the other side, which is actual fact goes from the side into the joint. This piece comes right down, overlaps here, and then carries on down here. And those are the joints which we were particularly interested in, which do not occur, according to Cecil Hewitt, who was my husband's buddy, who they were both woodwork teachers and knew a thing about planes and joints, which perhaps people at the Royal Commission didn't. And they were able to say that these joints were peculiar to these buildings and had been found in Westminster Abbey, in fact, in the work of Henry III, which is similarly in the 1200s. So the question is, are these joints peculiar to the 1200s? And if so, if we see them at another place, can we say, well, that must be 1200 as well? And that was the argument that they made. And most people at the time said, that's a load of absolute rubbish. Anybody could make any joint on any building at any time. And that was the popular view. Although as years went by, Cecil and Adrian were proved right that these joints do only occur in buildings which are more or less pre-1300. Also, so here we've now got in the barns at Cressing, the lower joint that you can see here is what we call the notch lap joint. It's entered from the side, so you can lay this flat on the ground and put the actual piece that's going in there, and then erect the whole thing as a whole. All the joints go from the side and are not mortise and tenon. It's a bit like those IKEA kits that if you don't put the right thing in first, you'll never get the last one in at all. So if they're all going in from the side of the actual wood, then you can lay them all flat on the ground in one piece before you actually try to put the whole truss up. This is the other joint, which is interesting, which is a joint which is made to make a very long piece longer. And if you've got two pieces and you want to join them, you can use this, and it goes, you can see the joint goes up, across, and then there's a square peg through the middle. It goes back on itself and then slopes back. And to hold it, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pegs which go right through the whole caboodle through and to hold the thing together. And these two joints between them, they proposed, were actual diagnostic signs of work pre-1300. And gradually, as we found on, we have in fact discovered that that is true. This is the joint in situ in the barns, and you can see it goes up, down, square hole, back on itself, and then it actually returns like that at the other side. So this is what we call a scarf joint, a blade and table scarf joint, which if you see in a building, you can get very, very excited and think, well, perhaps this building is as old as pre-1300. Which was in fact the case with Place House. So here we are. I'll just pop these in for the sake of argument. Here's the notch lap joint, which goes in from the side, and you can see how it fits. And sometimes you get two. Sometimes it's got a notch lap which stops it coming out. And you can see the barns that we've actually located at, and they are all very old in the 1200s. This is the scarf joints that we see, and this is the magic one from Place House, which is similar to the one at the barns because it goes up, square hole in the middle, and out and back on itself. And these are similar ones. Later, if Place House was later, we might see this joint or this joint. Or if we were going right in the time of Queen Elizabeth, we would come to this sort of joint. Now, I won't bore you with it. That's well published. And you can, this is out of Hertfordshire Past and Present quite a lot of years ago. But that is how we distinguish the age of a building just by looking at the joints, if you can actually see them, of course. Usually they're covered up with Harpic bottles because they're behind the lavatory or they're behind the curtains, and you have to sort of move them, and then you reveal all the cobwebs that the dear lady hasn't moved for the last 20 years. However, similarly with the floor joints, there is a sequence, and these different joints do in fact denote different periods of building. And in Hertfordshire and Essex, which are very similar, then these things pretty well hold water with a reasonable extent. So having discovered that that was so, they then had some people from America who came and did carbon-14 dating on some of the old buildings. And they proposed that what Cecil said was correct, that there were buildings surviving from the 1200s. And we're talking here about domestic buildings, not cathedrals, which is a different proposition. But there were buildings dating from 1200 and could be demonstrated by carbon-14. But then we had what we call dendrochronology, because if you cut a tree down, each ring that it's grown reflects the season of growing of that particular ring, and the better the weather, the bigger the ring. And you can then make a plot on a computer, which we then had and able to use, and you can actually measure each ring and make a graph of the ups and downs of the width of the ring, and then make them, marry them up across a long period. And by studying a lot of them, you can actually come up with the date. So this is just a sample of a Hertfordshire building, which turned out to be very useful. This picture is quite useful in several ways, because you can see that this building, a typical medieval building, has a straight run of roof in this direction, which is the hall, and very conveniently it's got a crown post in it, which adds to the source, and it has a wing, which the roof goes at the opposite direction. This has got 2 crown posts in it, but that's another story. However, there is a hall and a cross wing, and that is very characteristic of manorial buildings of the early Middle Ages. And you can see the doors at the bottom, which you went in through the door here, through a fancy door, into a little bit of passage, and then you can turn right into the lower part of the cross wing, or you can turn left and go into the actual hall, which was open right up to the roof. This one has a floor in, an upstairs and a downstairs. This one has not. It is all open from top to bottom, and there's a fancy end here where the lord or the boss of the outfit would sit at his table, and beyond that there may be more domestic areas for living in or other purposes. But in the case of Place House, all we're seeing, in fact, is the hall. We've lost both ends, as that may have existed, but don't at the time. Anyway, the great thing about this at Wymondley, Ware, was that when they did the actual dendro dates, this is the graphs of them, and you can see that the hall range, that's this bunch, end up with the summer of 1379, 1378, this sort of period. All those joints on that area end up in the 1370s, 1380. And the cross wing, the question was, is the cross wing contemporary with the hall or not? Or why would we want to know anyway? Anyway, in this case, these are the cross wing figures, and you can see that they are exactly the same date as the hall. So from that basis, we can say that this building, yes, was built in about 1380, and so the cross wing and the hall were the same period, and that's the end of that. And no argy-bargy, that is the fact. And you can now argue blue in the face, but that is true. So we come to Place House. So we went to look at Place House, and we suggested, by looking at it, which we'll look at in a minute, that it was very early. And the question is, how early? So what I've done now is to fish out 3 ladies who in fact had the possession of Place House during its long history. I've added this in from my talk that I gave previously, because I thought it might interest people. What we're talking about is Joan of Kent, who's here, who in fact inherited Place House from her mother, who was a Mrs. Wake, and the Wakes had held Place House and the Manor of Ware before Joan's birth. And Joan occurs in the, where's my cursor gone? It's just a minute. Here's Joan. She was the actual daughter of this younger brother of Edward I, and these are the sons of Edward III. And she ended up marrying, she comes up here as well, because she married the eldest son of Edward III, the Black Prince. So these are the brothers who were the Black Prince and his brothers, and Joan married into here. Now, Joan is quite famous for being the lady whose garter slipped and was the cause of the founding of the Order of the Garter by Edward I, who's here. I don't know where the cursor's disappeared here. Here's Edward I anyway. And his eldest son was a Black Prince, and he married this Joan, who inherited Ware Place from her mother. Let's go on. So here's Edward III with the Black Prince, and he's making him, he was Prince of Wales. He was one of the early Prince of Wales, but he was famous for having black armor and being the Black Prince, and fought various noble battles, mainly in France. But unfortunately, he died of a nasty disease, probably that he picked up in France, and he died very young, leaving Joan, who he had married, and a young son who became Richard, King Richard. And so I just popped this in so you can actually have a look at the Black Prince. And here's Richard. Richard II. This is the portrait of him in Westminster Abbey. Now, Joan, whether she actually came to any time to Place House Ware, we're not sure. David Perman seems to think that her funeral procession must have come through Ware because it was one of her possessions, and she certainly had an interest because she had funded part of the church at Ware. And the church at Ware, if you go in there, you will see several emblems of the White Hart, which was the emblem of her son Richard. So whether her funeral procession came and she actually entered her house at Place House, we shall never know. However, Place House, from our working out, was probably in best part of 100 years old when Joan of Kent came through. If she did in her coffin, we shall never know. However, she did in fact own it, and this is her son. This is Richard here, and he's got his little white hearts on his front of his gown, and the angels have all got white hearts. You see them all. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. All these angels have got white hearts on them to show that they are part of the entourage of Richard II. And he's got his patron saints, John the Baptist and Edward and Edmund, the 2 royal kings of England who were sainted. And the top here, he's got the flag of St. George, being the flag of not only George, but also the Garter, which was very interesting because his father, the Black Prince, had been one of the first Knights of the Garter, founded by his father. It is said that if you go to the National Gallery and you look very carefully at this blob at the top of the flag, you can see a little very, very tiny picture of Windsor Castle actually on the top of the flagstaff. You need to get there and have a really good old snoop. This is the Wilton diptych anyway in the National Gallery. If you haven't seen it, go and spend half an hour peering at the actual wonder of this fantastic piece of art. Anyway, there's Richard. And that's his wife's crown, which she was Anne of Bohemia, and she took a crown back. Well, after she died, her crown went back to Bohemia and is now part of the German royal regalia. But I just put that in because it's rather fine and shows you the sort of thing which was current at that time. Also, he was famous for building Westminster Hall, well, for re-roofing Westminster Hall. Westminster Hall had already been built by William Rufus in the 1090s, but by the time it got to Richard, which was the years shortly before 1400, it was in a very bad state. And Richard decided at the same time that his mother had owned Place House, that he would re-roof Westminster Hall. And I'm sure most of you have seen the Queen Mum and Churchill and similar people having their lines of state in there. And in actual fact, I did in fact myself walk right up to the angels at the top, because in between the Queen Mum and Churchill, they decided that they would have a repairing session and put the scaffolding up. While they were waiting for one of these important people to die, they thought, well, it wasn't worth putting the scaffolding up because they might have to pull it all down again sharpish. So anyway, the thing that we got to get into our heads is that these people were used to aristocratic building of the very highest standard. This was the most famous building in Europe at the time when it was built, and still stands to this day as, in fact, one of the finest examples of timber framing in Europe. Anyway, this is the arms of John of Gaunt, who was one of the Black Prince's brothers, and we'll come to him in a minute. You can see the royal arms on the right-hand side and the arms of his wife, who was Constanza of Castile, on the left. We'll get rid of them, but we used to have John of Gaunt, a pub in Ware, and we used to have a big statue of John of Gaunt standing at the bottom of the hill coming down from County Hall. But somebody has taken him away. I don't know where they put him, but it was quite nice to have John of Gaunt around because he, in fact, held the castle at Hertford. And while his his relations held Ware, of course. I've just put this in to sort of wake you up. This isn't John of Gaunt. I think we can see who this guy is. But what you can see is he's got his garter ribbon, and on his chest, he's got his garter star with the cross of St. George in the middle. And in the Middle Ages, if you were a member of the Order of the Garter, you were supposed to wear your insignia at some time. I think you were not obliged to take it off in the bath. And in fact, if you are, even to this day, a member of the Garter, you're supposed to wear a Garter George. This is George here, and this is a little figure of St. George on a ribbon, or preferably around your leg, around your left leg, around the knee. But the Prince of Wales and Prince William tend to wear a Garter ribbon around their shoulder rather than exposing their knees to general consumption. But you can see that these things persist from the time of the Black Prince. That's why I've stuck him in there, just to amuse. Anyway, so Joan of Kent may have come in her coffin through Ware, but this is now Margaret Beaufort, Lady Margaret Beaufort, who also owned Place House. Whether she actually came through that door, we don't know, but she certainly wrote a letter from Hatfield, where she'd been staying with the bishop, and she had horses who were stabled somewhere in Ware, and she wrote a letter to the people in Ware about my horses that are down there. Whether she actually came to Ware to sort out her horses, we don't know, but certainly Place House was part of her possessions, and she was the mother, of course. Let's put her up where she is. I'm sorry this is a bit fuzzy, but you can see she's slap in the middle here, Margaret Beaufort. And she was the mother of Henry VII and the granddaughter of John of Gaunt, which John of Gaunt comes into this, well, great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt. So she picks up the royal genes from various directions. And her son, Henry VII, was, of course, the father of Henry VIII. This is actually in King's College Chapel. It's quite a useful sort of thing, which I photographed. I thought, well, at least we've got a few pictures on there. We can see who's who. So here's Henry and the Yorks. These are the Lancastrians, of which Margaret was part, and the Yorkists on this side, consisting of Richard and Edward IV, and Elizabeth of York, who married this one. And then we've got the York and Lancaster joined together. Anyway, if you go to Cambridge, she founded two colleges in Cambridge, Christ's College, which is just behind Marks and Spencer's, and St. John's, which is over the other side near the backs. This is a bit of a fuzzy picture because I went in there and the reflection was in. However, this is the hall of Christ's College, and here's Lady Margaret holding her Bible. She had a terrible time giving birth to Henry VII. She was only 13 at the time, and she was in Pembroke Castle. They'll show you the room, and it was rather windy, I suspect, and she had a very nasty time, and she never gave birth to anybody ever again. We think she was probably very seriously damaged, and she never had another child apart from Henry VII. And she then took a vow of celibacy and became more or less a sort of half-time nun. Although she married two other gentlemen afterwards, she didn't actually have any children, and she maintained her religious convictions by founding these colleges. So this is in the interior of Christ's College. Here's Margaret. You'll see her. She's got the red rose of Lancaster. She's got the portcullis of the Beauforts. And down here, you can see the red roses. And you can also see what she liked to have was daisies, because she was called Margaret or Marguerite. And wherever she is around, you'll see daisies. So this is the arms, the royal arms in the middle, because she was a royal lady, and various accoutrements. These two animals either side are called yales. They're like rams with horns. They're not, strictly speaking, anatomically correct. They're a bit mythological yales, the Yale of Beaufort, and she liked to have an eagle sticking out of the top. I think her dedication to St. John, who is often exemplified by an eagle, was part of that thing. Anyway, here's the Yale on the door at Christ's College, and the Lancastrian red rose, and that's the front door as well. And you can see the Yales. This has got a bit boring. Anyway, if you walk outside St. John's College in Cambridge, you will see that the people of St. John's have very kindly, in the pavement, put little bronze daisies. they're supposed to be daisies, and they in fact mark out this piece of land, which is part of St. John's College, which is the way into St. John's College, and says that this is ours, and we'll let you walk on it for the time being, because it's part of the pavement, but it belongs to St. John's, and it's part of the gift of Margaret, and that's why we put her marguerites all over the pavement. But most people walk over them without even seeing them. But do have a look if you're passing there. I always like to think of Margaret when I walk past there and think, well, jolly good for Margaret. Anyway, so that's Margaret Beaufort. The other lady who I've got attached to Place House is Mary Tudor, who we also held Place House as part of her possessions. And this is the screen inside, which we'll talk about in a minute, which demarks the actual entrance to the hall from the main hall part. But what we're interested in looking at this is the actual bits of decoration which are on it, which actually give us a suggestion that it is referring to either Catherine of Aragon or her daughter, Mary. Now, I think David Perman and I are inclined to think, because of the other dates, that it is Mary, Queen Mary, Mary Tudor, that it is alluding to, because on the actual, I get this, where's this cursive actually? On the actual decoration, you will see roses, lots of roses, all of these, and also these pomegranates, which are often got split in half with the seeds coming out, or they're stuck together. And up the side here, you will see pomegranates and roses alternating, and similarly down here. What is also interesting is that there are acorns. If you look at the bottom here, there are acorns, and there's some acorns here. And then there are shamrock, I think they're shamrocks. They've got three-leaved things, and then there are thistles. So I'm inclined to think that there are Scotland, Ireland, and England. Wales has by this time got swallowed up into England, but the three emblems of the three countries are there, and the initials of R and W, who David Perman says is Richard Wells. And because his name was Wells, he liked to have a heraldic representation, which has these are supposed to be the lids of a well, which was part allusion to his actual name. But lots of roses and pomegranates. Let's just get them a bit closer, and then you can see them. So here you can see the pomegranates and the roses and the acorns and the shamrocks and the thistles and more W, that's the W from the other side, and the wellhead, and these various, he's got acorns here interspersed. But what is interesting is the allusion to the pomegranate and the Aragon heritage which Mary brought into the royal house, of course. So here's Mary. We haven't got any pomegranates there, but you can just see what she looked like. Whether she actually came and looked at her property at Ware, we don't know, but she certainly belonged to her. And here she is on a manuscript touching somebody for the Queen's evil. It was a part of the royal prerogative that if you touch somebody who got this disease of scrofula, then that they could get better. And she gave you a little badge to sing round your neck, which said, oh yes, I was touched by the Queen. And so that made you well. But what's interesting here is the pomegranate splitting open, because it was supposed to be the sign of fertility, and all the seeds would go and make lots of children, hopefully. It's one of the few representations I've actually found with Mary sitting right next to a pomegranate, which I thought was helpful. I've just put these in just to remind us what life was like in the 1200s. We are then postulating that the date of this house, Place House, was late in the 1200s, knocking on 1300. And these are from the Luttrell Psalter, which is slightly older, but it just gives you the feeling of what people looked like walking around in 1300. Here's a harrow and a horse. I'm sure most of you have seen pictures of the Luttrell Psalter, which is in the British Museum. And this is the chap getting on his horse with his lady saying, toodaloo, off you go, and Godspeed, and the actual heraldry of the Luttrell family, which was, here's his name at the top, Geoffrey Luttrell, fake it, had me made, which is referring to the actual book. Anyway, let's get rid of them. but we can see them all here sitting having dinner, which is why I put them on, because we can imagine perhaps at Place House, they'd have a long, big table and all the family and the important people would sit at the top, and the rest of the people would rush around in the kitchen, cutting up meat and bringing it on plates and bringing it up to be served to the family on the high table. So we can perhaps imagine that sort of scene in Place House in the year perhaps about 1300. Anyway, when Adrian and I first went to Place House, we went in and it was looking very sad. And we didn't actually know at that time what the date was, but after crawling around, we decided that it probably did date from before 1300 and that it was very, very important. And in spite of the milk bottle standing by the door, this door, which you can still walk into this very day and gives you a real buzz. Not the actual door pieces I'm talking about the actual arch over it. The door, actual door is obviously a later replacement. But to have milk bottles sitting in a hall like this one, I think is very atmospheric. Well, it seemed to us at the time. And when we went upstairs, we could see that there were incredible timbers showing and poking around. We then postulated that this building must be from about the time of the very late 1200s into early 1300. But it was at that time occupied by a gentleman called John Whitfield, who was one of the staff of the County Record Office. And he had bought it. He said he had bought it in a pub and paid, I don't know, very little for it to a chap who wasn't really quite sober. And he then took over this, realizing himself that it was very old and very interesting, and the manor house of Ware, and well worth preserving. But unfortunately, he had, I think he probably had TB, but when we first met him, he was very ill at the time and had determined that the Place House being so very important, so very old, that he would try and arrange after his death, which he actually anticipated quite shortly afterwards, that it should pass into public ownership. Anyway, you can see how it was when we first went in there, but we could see that the crown post at the top was very, very fine, that the actual timber work was incredible, a very, very high standard, and that if you got rid of all this rubbish, it might be worth preserving. See the sort of place that it was when we first went in. So a big argument was evolved, and Dorothy and the Hertfordshire Building Preservation Trust were actually instigators of ensuring that this building remained in public, well, in trust ownership, and was available to all and sundry forevermore, we hope, to be preserved for people of Ware. But of course, it had to be repaired in the meantime. So this was the sort of thing that Russ Craig and various other people from the actual contractors had to contend with. Dust and filth and God knows what. These are photographs taken from Anne's beautiful album. Do go, if you go over there, or ask Anne to show you. She has it at the castle usually, but she's got beautiful albums of pictures of the actual alteration of Place House. So it's very well recorded what it was like in the interim. So when they've actually pulled all the muck out, you could actually see the roof. So there's the crown post sitting on its tie beam, and the beautiful quality of the building. And what you can particularly note, and this is the decoration, this piece of wood which goes around the outside and is actually taken round the corner and round the corner again. And then in the second half, the other side is taken round there and round there and round there. And so that makes it a very, very superior building. The actual superior quality of this work and the actual fact that it's got this extra frill all the way around the inside marks it out as being courtly work of the very highest standard that was available in about the something between the 1270s and 1300. Anyway, what you will see now if you go in, thanks to the work of the Building Preservation Trust, you can now go in at Anne's invitation. She will invite you to tea and serve you with some beautiful china and a lovely cup of tea. And you can see the fineness of this beautiful hall. Now, obviously, what you need to get your eye in when you go in there, this is obviously replacement because a lot of repair had to go on. But underneath it all, you will see the actual members of the hall of 1270s or so. And you'll notice that it is black. because we contend that it was an open hall and they probably had a fire in the middle and the smoke went up there and the soot got entangled with the beams, and all the beams above this level are all black because they have the open fire below. So it was an open hall, and this was the pillar. We saw the other one with Dorothy standing next to it. This is one on the other side, but you can see that it had a decorated top, but it's been knocked around in various over the hundreds of years, and people have taken a swipe at it. But if you look at it very carefully, you can actually see the details of every little, you can actually see the moulding of the actual capital here. But you need to get your nose right up to it and have a good old look. And then when you get to the crown post, which you need to be, we can't see this, we've got to get up a ladder, but the quality of that work at the top and the actual dimensions of these braces, which are huge, and the lovely delicacy of the crown post and the fact that it carries this collar purling down the top is quite exceptional. That's a close of it, so you can see the bottom end as well, because it's got a nice, this is it during the repairs, obviously, and they have now put in some plasterboard and whatnot to make it more habitable, because although it was probably in medieval times open right to the roof, nowadays it would be better actually sealed in. So it is in fact plastered in between the rafters, but we've left the collar purling and the crown post so that you can see it. Well, up a ladder you can, because you'll be sitting down here. We're now at the first floor level when there was a floor in, but they took the floor out, of course, and left this top fancy plate which goes round. Anyway, let's go on. So that's what it looked like from below, and there's the crown post, and there's this fancy work round here, and they've plastered it all in so that it's much more habitable. Let's go on. So what you're looking at now then is two bays of a hall. In the Middle Ages, you went through the door here, and there was a passage went across here. Now the screen that we'd be looking at blocked off this passage here so that it was a bit less drafty when you went in the door, and you turned then left into the hall, and this was the hall, and there was a long bay and a short bay, and the crown posts in the middle, and it has most beautiful decorations on the actual pillars, and there were 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, of which this one is quite nice to see. That's the one that's next to Dorothy in the picture that I showed you first. This is the other side, which has a very nice, the bit that I was looking at just now was this arrangement here, where it had an aisle. We call these aisled halls because, like a church, they have a nave down the middle and an aisle at the side, the other side of the pillars. The aisle on this side has gone, but we can imagine what it must have been like by making a mirror image of it of this side. So this is what we're actually interested in studying, and the detail of the actual timber, which is particularly fine. This is that joint that we found. This is this fancy piece of frill at the top, which is too high for you to get to if you're right down below, but you can see how the actual moulding is taken round the corner. So you've got 2 pieces to join up together on a very difficult to make joint. And here is that scarf joint, which goes up, square thing in the middle, back on itself, and a peg through here. We've had a model made of it so that you can pull it to pieces, and Anne will lend it to you and allow you to pull it away, and you can see that it actually looks like this when it's actually dismembered, so to speak. So that again is an actual typical thing of the building, and we're talking now about the time when Westminster Abbey was being built, and not Westminster Hall because that was a bit later, but this is the sort of quality of work that we're talking about. That's the detail of the crown post. We see the top and bottom, which had been suggested by Harry Forrester a long time ago, before we went anywhere near it, that it was indicative of the reign of Edward I. We're talking about now about 1270 to 1307, and that is the period we're after. And he suggested that these particular mouldings were typical of that age, which is one of the things that we got so excited about. Anyway, as you go in right now, this is another of Anne's pictures. You go in through the door here, and do have a look at this beautiful moulding around here, and imagine as you walk through the door that all these very important people, because although the 3 ladies I'm talking about, Joan of Kent and Margaret Beaufort and Mary Tudor, may not have actually walked through, well, they may have gone through, they certainly owned the building, and certainly their representatives would have gone through there to collect the rents and make sure that the courts were held and what have you. This is the screen which we were looking at previously, which we think probably dates from the 1550s or so, the reign of Mary Tudor. And this is the corner which we were looking at. And this is that beautiful arch and the beautiful top of the column here. Good. So people say, what's happened to the other side of the wall? There is a separate flat, in fact, and which is let off by the trust to the right-hand side of the hall. And that's just to give you an idea of what it's like in there. It's not part of the actual hall, but this part is. And that's the top of the actual building. You can see the actual joint, the scarf joint is here, and it goes, not only does it go back, but it's actually pointed. Where the actual joint goes into there is on has a point, the link goes up, square dowel through and then back. And here's this fancy bit round the top. So, you know, you just have I know it's easy to walk in there and say, yeah, a lot of lovely old beams, but there's more to it than that. The actual craftsmanship of this particular building is of courtly standard. It's not your old farmer Giles round the corner. It is the manor house of Ware, owned mainly by these particular ladies I've discussed, of royal descent and of royal interest, and actually was of the highest standard that there was available at the time. So that's Place House, that's the detail. You can see just on this bit here, a bit of the detail of the actual, what it must have been like when it was new. What you have to imagine is what it was like when it was freshly carved, and these things were beautifully figured, and you can actually get your hand up behind here and look at the actual detail of where this brace comes down in here. It's well worth just actually putting your head into the mind of the carpenter who was making it and thinking, you know, this chap knew what he was doing. And you can see some of the black up here, of course. Let's go on. Anyway, that's the outside of Place House, and the garden is made very beautiful, and there's a very nice explanation here, even if the doors are shut. But if you want to go in, have words with Anne, and she will be very welcome to arrange for you to visit. And I've been several times and found a class of ladies doing Keep Fit or having a lecture or having a birthday party. So people said at the time, whatever are you going to do with that fusty old building full of old mattresses? And we said, well, surely somebody in Ware will be interested. And in fact, now it's let virtually every day of the week for some function or other. Well, it was when we could have functions. So it, in fact, I understand from Dorothy, generates enough income to more or less just scrape through, which is all that we're really interested in, as long as it isn't a drag on the rates, which that would be a terrible thing to be. But anyway, that's what it looks like right now. So I'm going to draw attention to another house which is similar in lots of ways in date and status, just to put in another timber frame building from Hertfordshire, just to make weight from the actual what I was talking about. So this is Thorley Hall, up behind Bishop Stortford. If you go around the new well, it's not new now, but it was new about 20 years ago, the bypass which goes around the back of Bishop Stortford through Thorley and past Thorley Church. Thorley Church is just behind here, and this is Thorley Hall. And as you look at it from the road, it looks like a Queenie Annish house, and you mightn't even think it was timber framed, because it's brick built and it's symmetrical with doors and windows either side of quite a classical sort of door. But there's something fishy, the fact that it's got no chimneys here except one that's sticking out from the back, and it's one of those what we call a concertina stack. It's sort of crinkled, pleated in the middle of it, which is not Queen Anne. This one is, of course, to do with this room at the end here, but there's something fishy about the end here and the actual disposition of the windows. But if you just walk behind the tree here and look at it go through that gate and look at it behind the tree, you will see this is the actual brick wall that we were looking at. This is the tree. And you'll see that there's the chimney sticking out with its pleats in it, and that it is, in fact, the classical hall and crosswing, as we were discussing at Wymanleybury. But the question is then, is the hall and crosswing contemporary? Was it an open hall? They've put a chimney in at some date. These chimneys normally date from what, 1500, that sort of time. So this is obviously not the original heating mechanism, but added later. And this is the crosswing, which is floored, has an upstairs and downstairs. but the hall presumably was open from top to bottom, and there's a door to go in, exactly as you do at Place House. So when we go in, this is the cross wing at Thorley Hall, and you can see it's the crown post, which you can see is not as grand as the one at Place House, but getting on that way. But what's interesting is that it is completely clean. It has not been kept clean by the people who live there going up there with a feather duster. It is clean because it was never exposed to smoke from a fire below, because there was a floor below. It's actually an upstairs and downstairs building, and this is the upper chamber, which was never exposed to filthy smoke going up through the roof. But it's a very fine crown post, and you can see it's got the collar pearl in here and the 4 struts and perch on the top of the crossbeam. So that's the cross wing at Thorley Hall. But if you go into the hall wing at Thorley Hall, you'll see it is black as black, because it was exposed. The hall had a fire on the floor, and the timber has become completely blackened with the smoke from the open hall. And it is still to this day maintaining the black stuff, because it is now above the ceiling. When it was built, of course, there would be no floor in here. It would be open right to the floor. And this has been put in to make an upstairs and downstairs in the hall block. So what we've done is to go in there and look at the actual structure. And what's interesting here is that there are 2 of these joints, which we were talking about earlier, the notch lapse joints, which would say to yourself, well, perhaps those are pre-1300, you never know. But there was something going out up there and down there, which has been taken out, but leaves the actual mortises for the actual joints that are empty. And the same piece of wood goes down here, and there is one of those frilly tops, because when it was originally built, there were pillars down here, exactly like Place House. The pillars have been taken out, which we'll talk about in a minute. But this actual arrangement here is very similar. And if we're postulating a date of the 1200s, then that's a good method to do it. This chap is actually taking the sample. What you have is a special drill, which takes a sample about the size of a pencil, and then you take it away and you count the actual rings, you measure each one, you plot them on a graph, and you can then marry it up to strings of other graphs from other buildings all over the country, particularly locally. And if you're lucky, fit it in and find an actual date that you can say, yes, this tree was growing in and was felled in this particular date. So that's actually what they do. Makes a bit of a mess. And usually it's up to me to go around with a hoover and pick up the bits. But that's part of the exercise, I suppose. Anyway, as we look at Thorley Hall, then, you see the similarity to Place House on this side. Here's the pillar, there's the fancy capital, here's the bit going up, here's the tie beam, here's the crown post, here's the collar purlin. So all this arrangement is similar, but at some time or other has got a saw and sawed this off, chopped it through there, and instead put in a special piece coming out here and supported by this. Now, this is not dissimilar from, I'm not saying it's a copy of Westminster Hall, but it is a hammer beam. The fashion became to take out pillars from the middle, beg your pardon, and replace them with these sort of cantilevered brackets which go back to the wall, and leaving this bit sort of in mid-air, which is called the hammer beam. They also took out this piece, which we saw the joints of, which were here, and they've gone. So they've taken that bit out and sawed this way out of the middle. But this is what you would have seen originally. And when we actually got to the point of dating these things, we decided on the basis of the actual dendrochronology dates that the core of the building, which was this bit and the bit that went down here and the bit across the top here and the joints here, in fact dated from 1253. So Place House must have been, they're thinking about it, probably might have been, but certainly within a lifetime of this same building. And we also knew from this dating here that the hall and the cross wing were not the same build. That the cross wing, which is up here, was in fact built in 1397, which is an interesting thing. And that in 1397, somebody sawed off the pillars here and put in these brackets to support them, which are there to this day. Subsequently, they put a ceiling in down here to make an upstairs and a downstairs, which is why in the bedroom, where you can see that chap making holes up here, This is the bedroom. This is now sealed in so that that is the attic, and that's where all that smoky stuff was at the top there. But it's all smoky because even in 1397, it was an open hall right the way through until they decided to put in that brick chimney, which was probably Henry VII, something like that, but a good 150 years after. So we're now going back to, you know, the time of the Black Prince and all these early medieval people into 1250s, right the way through the 1400s and right up to the present day, which is quite remarkable. Let's go on. So now you see the bedroom in which we were doing this digging around. These are the chaps doing it. It's my, as I said, it's my unfortunate task to try and keep friends with the lady of the house and make sure that they don't leave an absolute filthy mess everywhere. But you can see now that this is the actual joints that were here. This is the head of the pillar, which went right down through this floor, and the actual crown post and whatnot is above the ceiling. So when you're looking at these timber frame houses, you've got to sort of get your head round to going up in the attic and out through the loft and then into the bedroom and then down below, and try and keep in your head a sort of three-dimensional picture of what was going on when it was new. And these timbers were all bright and shiny in new oak, and must have looked very, very spectacular. Let's go on. So at that point, I'm going to stop talking about those timber frame buildings. If anybody wants to ask me anything, please do so. All right, Anne?
Yes, yeah, I'm just waiting to see if anyone's going to type any questions into the chat. I think
please say if you've got anything to say. I'm sorry I've not put the whole county of timber frame buildings. They're on a separate PowerPoint. Come another day and we'll look at more of those. But I thought it was Place House that we were particularly interested in, and particularly the personalities who had in fact owned it, which has been an interesting fact for me for the last few months. I've been sort of looking, while I've been stuck at home, I've been imagining these dear royal ladies and their beautiful house, which we can go and have tea in on a Sunday with Anne.
Yes, if only we can get back to that. Yes. Right, so we've got a question from Mary Rutherford. Very interesting. Would the timbers lower down in the hall have been painted, or other decorations on walls?
Possibly, yes. In fact, paint tends to get worn off, but frequently, as with churches, you get little tiny bits of, particularly the red ochre tends to stick behind. Yes, I think they were far more decorated than we imagine, often fairgroundish. I can't say that we've got any, there are evidence of and if you go into the building trust's other building at Much Haddam, you will see the painting there, the wall paintings on plaster, but we're talking about painting on timber. Particularly, it seems to survive, particularly, I'm thinking of Carlisle and Edinburgh, where there are beautiful timber ceilings and walls with incredibly elaborate painting on them, mostly from the Tudors onwards. Very early painting on timber is quite rare and doesn't seem to have survived very well. But I think you're right. I don't think they like things plain. They like things fancy, with lots of silver and gold and red and green, as you see on the manuscripts. Any illustrations of medieval buildings are usually very garish.
And you better bring us all back. We can't see each other, let alone.
Oh yes, bring us back.
Helen Gibson.
Yes, if people want to turn their videos back on. Are there any more questions to put into the chat? Or indeed, if you want to unmute yourselves and ask a question.
Unmute yourselves and say something.
This isn't doing it.
Onslow here, Helen.
Yes,
I was involved with.
When the three ladies
Can you hear me?
were in charge of the
Can you hear
building.
me, Helen? It's John Onslow. I was
Yes, I
involved
see
with. And we won a, I don't know, European architectural Heritage Award or something with those. Now they're a bit later than you're talking about, but they had some very interesting joints in as well.
Sorry, I didn't catch the first sentence that you said. Which building are
said-
we talking about?
Croxley Green
All right,
at
Yes.
the Joan of Arc school site.
right. Yes,
Joan of Arc school didn't actually want anything to do with them really, but they were part of the school site really. And they had, we had to change the entrance because the local farmer refused to allow an entry on his side.
yes,
But it did involve quite a lot of work, both woodwork and so on. And they had, I think they were a bit later than Place House, but do you
Yes.
know anything about?
No, I don't know about the cottages. I do know about the barn because the Dorothy and I and the Preservation Trust have taken a long interest in the barn here, which is also the property of the school, the Joan of Arc school. But unfortunately, as you say, to get to this farm behind there, you've got to go more or less across the railway and up the side of the stream and through a lot of bramble bushes, and you might get there. And there's been a lot of controversy as to what goes on around that barn and in that farmyard.
Well, when I left them
That's the
in
barn
19,
we were
I
talking about, the school
was
one.
dealing with them in about 1975.
Right,
And of course, we left them in perfect condition at that time.
right.
Been allowed to
I haven't
go
turned it
downhill
on.
since
Can I get
then.
them in, them sit down?
Yes, the actual barns there, if you get, well, we had James, Anne was talking to me recently about James Betley and him publishing the new edition of Hertfordshire Pevsner. And if you go to the expense of buying one, which are worth every penny of every page, do a rush out and buy your James Betley's Hertfordshire Pevsner. You will see 2 double pages of the barns, including the one at Croxley Green, which Adrian and Lee Prosser, who wrote the chapter, which was done after Adrian died, about the barns, which I would have talked about had I been not talking about Place House. The barns, there of which there are, I think, 8 now, built by the Abbot John Moot, the Abbot of St Albans Abbey. And there's a suite of barns there, all of which are interesting and are actually illustrated and described in the new Pevsner. So rush out and buy a Pevsner if you haven't got one already, because they might run out and you mightn't get one.
Thank you, Helen. I think your talk was a tour de force. Thank you so much.
Helen, we've got another couple of questions in the chat.
Yes.
What happened to ownership of Place House after Mary Tudor?
After Mary Tudor, this chap, Mr. Wells, had his name on it, and he did in fact occupy it, according to David Pearman, who studied all this. If you look at his book about Ware, it's called A New Guide to Ware, I think. He deals with all this, and there were various owners. It went out of royal hands at that point into secular people, and subsequently, I don't know if Christ's Hospital bought it and owned it or whether they rented it, but it was certainly in the occupation of Christ's Hospital when they actually used the main hall as teaching facilities. And we've now got a lovely blue coat boy to stand inside there, and a desk for him to sit at, and a statue of him outside, and the cottages in which they lived, which are still all there. So it then went to the blue coat establishment, Christ Hospital. After that, I'm not quite sure exactly what happened before John Whitfield bought it. I think he must have bought it in the 50s at some point and lived in it after a fashion before he died. And then the problem was, how was it going to be maintained into public ownership? And his intention was that that should happen. But Dorothy, I've no doubt, will tell you the aggro that there was with the National Trust and English Heritage and European this and that, and the Memorial Fund, and getting together enough money to maintain it and buy it and do it up. Because you can imagine the state that it was in when the Trust took it over was very, very sad. But it is now absolutely triumphant, and we're happy to welcome anybody anytime to show you our beautiful hall.
Dorothy? We can't hear you, Dorothy. No. Oh.
I can see her now. I can
Yes,
I
we
can see her.
you, but we can't hear you. I've got another question on chat. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much. We have learnt so much. Do you think that the architecture in Hertfordshire is the same as in Bedfordshire, e.g. Bushmead Priory?
Bushmead Priory is very, very interesting. It is early. It is a monastic building. I haven't dealt with religious buildings because they are a different, in many ways they are similar in some ways, but they are a different, you know, kettle of fish, you might say. Yes, but once you get the other side of the Great North Road, things tend to change, and you're getting much more into the west. And in fact, there are some cruck buildings in the west of Hertfordshire. Leverstock Green, there are I think 2, and a cruck barn at Gadsden, I think it is. But once you get the other side of Hertfordshire, you are beginning to get into a sort of different feel of Midland as opposed to East Anglian traditions. And I agree with what she says. What was the building she was talking about?
Bushmead Priory.
Oh, Bushmead Priory. Yes, Bushmead Priory is very interesting and well worth visiting if you can. And some of these things apply, but of course, as I say, it's a religious house. I can't remember which order it was, but it is well worth visiting. It's just the other side of St. Neots.
I think that's all the questions in the chat at the moment. Dorothy would have sort of wrapped things up and said thank you to you. I don't know if Richard, would you like to finish up?
Helen, that was a really wonderful evening because you've taken us around the place and you put Place House into beautiful context, given us its history and it's the way it was constructed and how it looks so wonderful, thanks to a lot to your husband and the work of the early days of the trust. But thank you very much. You've had a wonderful evening, and we're sorry we can't. We can see Dorothy. We can't.
We can see Dorothy.
Yes. She's clapping. She's clapping seriously. Helen, thank you very much for your time, Helen. And you must come and lead us around the countryside yet again.
It's entirely my pleasure.
Round the barns, and it's lovely to have it tied up with the barns, which is where Adrian taught me a lot, for which I'm very grateful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there's lots of messages coming through on the chat. Thanking you very much, Helen.
Okay. I don't know quite what the programme is for the better weather that we hope we're getting, whether it will be possible to have your tea anymore, or whether it's all completely dependent on regulations and rules, and it's a dreadful shame that people can't come and enjoy their tea parties and what have you, but there's absolutely nothing nobody can do at the moment, is there? But
No.
We do thank Anne for all, particularly in the beautiful china and the tablecloths, and everything's beautifully arranged, and the cakes, of course, are absolutely fantastic. Which gives a completely different, it gets a different lot of people to go in there. What we want is footfall in there of young people, old people, historical people, dancing people, yoga people, whatever they are. What we want is people in there, don't we?
Absolutely, yes. Hopefully by the summer, things will be starting to get a little bit more back to normal. So fingers crossed.
It's very difficult for for bodies like the trust, and I mean all these charitable, you know, entities to wonder where do we go from here, and what is the future, and how do we finance these things, and how do we maintain the actual momentum that has been built up over all these years to keep these things on the boil. And the last thing we want is for them to go off the boil, isn't it?
That's right, yes. I mean, thankfully for Place House, we've had some grants to help keep us going, so that's been really good. But yes, obviously that we can't keep on getting grants because they're not going to be able to keep providing them. But yeah, that's helped for the last year anyway.
Good.
There's a couple more. Thank you, Helen, for great talk. You showed my friends and I from Waltham Abbey Historical Society around Cressing Temple Barns, and it was a wonderful day. Thank you to Helen, really interesting. Looking forward to some tea soon. She's right about the cakes. I'm glad I read that one out. Right, okay, shall we
Thank you.
wrap things up then? Thank you very much. Right, thank you everyone for coming.
Bye, Anne.
Bye.